Hi, good morning, everyone. Glad to have you here on a Saturday morning. Thank you for being here. Thank you for showing interest in this topic. Let me just introduce you very briefly to who GCF is, in case you don't know us. We are the Graduate Christian Fellowship, and we are affiliated to the Fellowship of Christian University Students, or focused as they're more known. We are the graduate arm of a ministry that focuses on student and university ministry. We try to look for issues that are current and important to Christians, perhaps areas that Christians don't talk about in their churches or communities, and we try to sort of discuss those issues and see whether we have a unique approach from the Bible that can help us understand these issues better and understand how to engage those issues. So that's kind of the thinking that's behind this program. We have seen a trend towards talking more openly about environmental issues, not only the world over, but also in Sri Lanka. But sometimes that attention is garnered by, because, you know, it is politically motivated, or there are other concerns that sometimes drown out the actual environmental concerns. So one of the discussions that we had as an organizing committee was how Christians, how and why Christians should care about the environment. It might be that we just care, but we don't know why, or how the Bible helps us understand why we should care about this issue. So that's from where our motivation to run this program came. Just before I go into introducing the speakers to you and starting the program off, let me just quickly run you through some housekeeping rules. Please, it would be very helpful if you can keep your mic muted right throughout the program, so that there will be very little interference with the speakers. The other thing is that if you have any questions, you are free to type them in the chat, which is generally located at the bottom of your app. Please reply everyone, so that everyone on this conversation can see your question, and your question will be picked up later by the moderator, Amal Kumar. But please do mention any questions that you do have. Please put them in as they come to you, or you can wait until the end and send in your questions as well, but use the chat facility to do that. The session will run like this. I will be introducing each speaker before they take up and speak for about 25 minutes. They will leave us with some questions to think about as well. And then we will have a moderated Q&A session for 30 minutes. So that is how the whole session is going to run. And hopefully you will be able to engage and bring up any questions that you have as well. So a reminder again that if you are not speaking, please do mute your mic. During the question and answer session, the moderator may ask you to unmute, and then you're free to do that. Should we pray before we all start? Let's pray. Father, we thank you for bringing us all together as a body of Christ. We identify ourselves as Christians, as those interested in the Bible, as well as the issues that are going on in our environment. Father, I pray that this morning will be fruitful in our discussions and our thinking. We thank you for the three speakers, and we pray that their experiences, their own engagement with issues will be used to speak to us, that you will speak through their lives and their experiences to us. I pray that all of us will be engaged, and that we will be able to truly understand how we should engage with our environment as Christians, as those who believe in your word and who identify as Christ followers. We thank you for this time, Father. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. Let me dive straight into introducing our first speaker. If you've been for GCF events before, you know Vinod already. Vinod Ramachandra is IFES Secretary for Dialogue and Social Engagement. IFES is a university ministry that is international. It has national movements affiliated to it, and we know this in charge of helping people in universities think about how to engage their universities. So much of his writing has also touched on environmental issues along with many other issues that come. He is very insightful in ways that we struggle to understand issues, and we're really glad to have him here. He will be speaking to us about the biblical perspective of how we can understand whether the Bible gives us a mandate to be interested in the environment and any environmental concerns. So Vinod, over to you now.
Okay. Thank you very much, Ruth. I need to share my... Okay, thank you very much to the GCF for inviting me to be part of this seminar. And the subject, as you know, is whose world? When we think of the world, we think of two aspects to it. There is what we call the natural world, or the non-human world, everything from stars and galaxies to plants to animals to oceans, the atmosphere and so on. And then you have the human world, human beings and the creation of human hands and human brains. And these two worlds are interconnected and have always been inextricably intertwined. Here on the left, you have two trees, two of the most ancient trees on the planet, part of a forest that I had the privilege of visiting some years ago in New Zealand. These trees are more than 2,000 years old. And trees and plants like this are actually part of our human identity. We would not be here as human beings if not for the non-human world that predates us by several billions of years. And then on the right-hand side of your screen, you see the human world. This is a photograph of San Francisco in Northern California, downtown San Francisco. And if you've been following the news recently, you know that every year there are forest fires in California. Some of them are man-made, but most often they are natural fires. But in the last few years, the intensity and the scale of those fires has increased, largely on account of global warming, a human activity. As temperatures rise, the intensity and the scale and the subsequent destruction to vegetation and even to human property and human lives escalate. So this is downtown San Francisco, enveloped not only in smog, but also in forest, with smoke from forest fires. So human activity impacts the non-human world, and then what goes on in the non-human world in turn affects our human living. In fact, scientists in recent years have come up with a new term called the Anthropocene. The Anthropocene. Anthropos is the Greek word for human. And so the Anthropocene is a new geological epoch that the world has entered, where for the first time in its history, human activity is the primary shaper of what happens in the Earth's ecosystems, whether they are oceans or the atmosphere or rivers or the nutrient cycles and so on. So we are now in the Anthropocene. Some dated to the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century. Others, in fact, say it's post-World War II. That doesn't really matter. The important thing is that we are now in an epoch where the human and the non-human intersect together in ways that our forefathers could not imagine. So whose world is it? Well, the Bible is very clear. Psalm 24:1, the earth is the Lord's and everything in it. Not only the earth, but all the galaxies, the entire universe. Psalm 59-12, again, very typical of biblical thinking, that every animal, every bird, everything belongs to God. Archbishop Rowan Williams, a former Archbishop of Canterbury, sums it up this way. He says, the world is in the hands of another, The earth that we inhabit is more than we can get hold of in any one moment, or even in the sum total of the movements that we spend with it. The biblical understanding of creation is not just limited to the opening chapters. Many of the Psalms actually celebrate God's love for his world and the world's praise of its creator. Psalm 104 is perhaps the best known and the longest of these creation hymns. The climax of biblical thinking about creation is actually found in the chapters Isaiah 40 to 55, sometimes called Second Isaiah. The closing chapters of the book of Job also speak of God delighting with the creatures in the sea and the birds of the air. So long before humans appear on the scene, God delights in the non-human world that he has brought into being and he sustains in being. T.S. Eliot, a well-known American poet, all things affirm thee in living, the bird in the air, both the hawk and the finch, the beast on the earth, both the wolf and the lamb, the worm in the soil and the worm in the belly. So the way that the creation worships God, the non-human creation worships God, is simply by being, by just existing, by doing what it's intended to be. And it appears that only human beings, all God's creatures, refuse to worship God. We refuse to be what God intends us to be. You will not find the word nature anywhere in the Bible. Well, there are a couple of references in the New Testament to human nature, but the biblical writers never thought of the concept of nature. Nature is a modern concept, understood as a self-enclosed, self-sufficient system of processes and mechanisms. And the biblical writers never thought of the world in terms like that. Nor do we find the word environment anywhere in the Bible. The environment is actually a rather anthropocentric word. That is, it's centered on ourselves. Whose environment are we talking about? It is us. We are the center, and what is outside of us, what is around us, we call the environment or the natural environment. But I said earlier that actually what's outside of us is also within us. We are products of the world around us. If you studied chemistry, physics, you know that every chemical element in our bodies was cooked in the stars billions of years ago. So that non-human world is not simply outside of us, it's also part of us, and we are part of that world. So yes, we can continue to use this word environment, but ironically, it's an anthropocentric term. And it's, I say ironic, because there are people who criticize Christians for giving too much emphasis to human beings as opposed to other species. And yet in using this term environment, they are the ones who are being anthropocentric rather than theocentric. So the word that the Bible uses repeatedly is the word creation. And Christians today have begun to use the language not of caring for the environment, but caring for creation. And I find it very interesting that there are non-Christian biologists and environmental activists have also started using the language of creation and creation care, even though they don't believe in a creator. It's odd, it's strange, perhaps it's a contradiction. But why they like the language of creation is because creation speaks of dependence, of interdependence. For Christians, creation means that the world is dependent on another who is beyond creation and yet sustains creation. And so creation speaks of integrity, unity, dependence, interdependence, and so on. It's a very rich concept. So I will interchangeably, I guess, be using the word creation with also the word nature or the natural and the environment, largely through force of habit. So I'm not saying that we should not use the words nature and environment as Christians, but I think we need to pay more attention to the way these words are actually used. How do we then think of the natural world or the creation? Well, there are two extremes that we find amongst most people. There are those who think that the world belongs to them. They're owners. It's owned by governments or the United Nations or the multinational corporations or the resources on the earth or under the earth are there, owned by us human beings, and we are there to develop them and use them and perhaps also sell them to others. And this again contradicts the biblical understanding that we human beings are not owners. The only owner, the absolute owner, is God, and we will answer to God for what we have done with his creation. At the other extreme, you find particularly in traditional cultures or traditional religions, a more passive approach. We are not owners, but we are guests. If you're invited as a guest to somebody's home, you don't start rearranging the furniture or suggest that he pulls down a wall and builds something else, or that he builds a second story to the house. As guests, we are passive, we are receptive. We gratefully accept what comes to us, but we don't think of tinkering or changing or altering the environment. Now we shall see that Christian thinking about creation goes beyond the model of ownership as well as the model of the guest. Along with this, we have people who approach the natural world with a sense of mastery. We develop science and technology in order to control, to predict, to master natural processes, to harness them and use them for our betterment. So the predominant model or image in this way of thinking is that of a human being mastering a passive object. At the other end of the spectrum, you find again in traditional cultures, traditional religions, an attitude of veneration towards nature. We are guests, like I said, and therefore we revere nature. Nature itself is divine, and there's the language of Mother Nature, even the language of goddess and goddess worship that has come to the fore in recent years in movements such as ecofeminism or eco-spirituality. It's a new form of ancient paganism, the belief that nature itself is divine and to be worshipped. And so in such cultures, it's not surprising that modern science, modern technology never developed. But again, ironically, the people who speak this language actually make use of modern science and modern technology. So how then are we to think of our relationship with non-human creation? Well, in the two well-known creation stories that we find in the first two chapters of Genesis, we find a very rich theology of the human. And let me remind you that when we read these early chapters of Genesis, we don't read them as scientific historical accounts. That is not their purpose. They are picture stories or parables, a bit like in 1 Samuel chapter 11, Nathan goes to David and he tells him a parable. He describes events that really happened, but in the form of a parable. So think of Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 as parables or picture stories which carry rich philosophical or theological meanings. They're there to answer questions like, what is distinctive about human beings? What is our place as humanity within the universe? How do we relate to God? And how do we relate to one another within the human family? So the first thing that we are told about us human beings is that we are earthlings. The word Adam literally means from the earth. In the first creation story in Genesis 1, this is brought out by the fact that we human beings are created on the 6th day of creation along with the other animals. In the second creation story, we read of God taking the dust of the earth, or clay from the earth, and modeling it and forming a human being, a human person. So these are two different ways of saying that we come from the earth. We belong to the animal kingdom. We didn't fall from heaven already made. We are part of an ongoing story of the non-human world. We have emerged from that non-human world. So the earth is our home. But although we are animals, we also transcend the animals. We are not defined by our biological or physiological nature. And this is brought out by the fact that in the second creation story, man is called to name the animals. You could think of this as a very primitive understanding of science. In an ancient culture, to give something a name was to understand its essence, its meaning, its purpose. So the picture of Adam naming each animal is a way of him exploring, understanding, doing rudimentary science. So he is an animal that seeks to explore and to understand animal nature, which is something that the other animals don't do. So all animals die, but the human animal is unique in that he not only defies death, but sometimes embraces death for the sake of other values like truth and love and justice. Humans are the only animals who laugh at their animal nature, which is why we make jokes about animal functions. We make jokes about sex, because we know that we are not defined by our animality, even though we are animals. We transcend it. We ponder, we reflect on our human existence. We are creatures who try to make sense of the world in which we're living. So other animals may also lose their eyesight or fracture their limbs, but they need us human beings to restore their eyesight through surgery or to repair their limbs. So we must never lose sight of this dual aspect to human beings. Created along with the other animals, part of our animal kingdom, sharing a lot of our DNA with the other animals, but also distinctive, unique. And our distinctiveness is a difference of degree and, a difference of kind and not just of degree. And that is why in the Genesis 1 story, having created man and woman, God makes them in his image, and he declares to them that they are now to have dominion over the earth. They're asked to rule the earth. Now we tend to read into those words like dominion and rule our fallen human understandings. And so we think of dominion as dominating or exploiting. We think of rule as abuse, because that is often how we experience human rule. But remember the whole context of Genesis 1. The way that God rules in Genesis 1 is by bringing order, by bringing diversity, by delighting in what he brings into being and pronouncing it good and very good. This is a God who rules by serving what he brings into being. And so this is where the language of stewardship comes into its own. And this is a concept that Christians down the ages have used in speaking of human dominion or human rule over the earth, over its resources, over other species, and so on. I prefer to prefix the word stewardship with the word dependent, just to bring out the fact that we are not masters, but that we ourselves are dependent on what we are stewarding. So there is a relationship of mutuality. We steward as a fellow creature with other creatures. So our moral and rational superiority is not to make us, in order not to make us arrogant, but rather to make us humble servants of that which we rule. And this is very clearly brought out in the second creation story in those early chapters of the Bible. In Genesis 2, in verse 15, the man is put in the garden with the woman, and he is told to till the earth and to serve it. Literally, that's the word in Hebrew. Till the earth and serve it. Most of our translations translate keep it, till the earth and keep it. These two aspects, to till or to cultivate the earth, to develop its potential, and also to keep it, to preserve it, to protect its diversity. This is what today people speak of when they use this phrase, sustainable development. But the concept is there in Genesis 2:15. These two aspects of our creation mandate, two aspects of having dominion. One is that of development. So we are not to be passive guests, but we are to actually explore and to unlock the latent potential that is there in the earth and amongst the earth's creatures. Those natural processes are to be developed, even to be enhanced, in order to serve not only human betterment, but the betterment of the whole planet. And then we are also to conserve. We are to leave for future generations a planet that is richer than what we found it to be. So development and conservation go together. Here's a theologian, Colin Gunton. I quote from his essay, The Doctrine of Creation. He says, there is a proper human dominion over the creation, which must not be confused with a wrongful domination and exploitation. A garden without a gardener will produce little of the food and other necessities for the life of the one who is furless and clawless among the most vulnerable of the world's species, that is us humans. A pantheism, that is a worship of nature, in which we are simply a function of the world's process, is a world in which our otherness, our capacity to be ourselves, would be taken away. Rather than reacting in this way, we need to move from seeing creation as a mere given to receiving it as a gift to be cherished, perfected, and returned as grace, evoking gratitude. When Berry, a well-known Christian conservationist, writes, to live, we must daily break the body and shed the blood of creation. When we do this knowingly, lovingly, skillfully, reverently, it is a sacrament. When we do it ignorantly, greedily, clumsily, destructively, it is a desecration. In such a desecration, we condemn ourselves to spiritual and moral loneliness and others to want. So yes, we need to cut down trees to use timber to build homes, but it's a very different thing from cutting down trees and forests in order to build multiple mansions for ourselves or superhighways and to destroy biodiversity without seeking to replace what we have destroyed. That is often motivated not by the human need for shelter, but rather by human greed. Pope Francis, in a famous document published a few years ago on the care for our common home, he writes, the principle of the maximization of profits, frequently isolated from other considerations, reflects a misunderstanding of the very concept of the economy. As long as production is increased, little concern is given to whether it is at the cost of future resources or the health of the environment. As long as the clearing of a forest increases production, no one calculates the losses entailed in the desertification of the land, the harm done to biodiversity, or the increased pollution. In a word, businesses profit by calculating and paying only a fraction of the costs involved. In the New Testament, we have an eschatological hope for creation. Romans 8, verses 19 to 24 is the best known passage that speaks of the non-human creation along with us, groaning and waiting for that day when they too will share in our physical, material resurrection. The creation now is subject to futility, to decay, to death, but in some way that we cannot fully understand or even imagine. The world too is going to share in Christ's resurrection along with human beings. So this is a cosmic home. And the New Testament ends with that wonderful picture, Revelation 21 and 22, not of us human beings escaping from our current home and going off to a place called heaven, but the opposite, of heaven coming down to earth, heaven pictured as a heavenly garden city with a tree of life and a river of life flowing through the center of the city. This is a picture of a new heaven and new earth, a new creation, in which all that is good and true and just and beautiful in the present world is redeemed or rescued from its bondage to decay and to idolatry and to evil, and resurrected along with us in that new world. Now, sadly, many Christians in our churches don't get that picture, because they are brought up on what I call theological red herrings, that is, theological distractions. They're taught about things like the rapture, that before Christ returns, all Christians are going to be whisked off the face of the earth, and God is going to destroy the earth. And they take certain verses, misquote them or quote them out of context in order to tell us, why should we care about this world, this earth, when everything is going to be ultimately destroyed and our home is going to be in another world? Now, even if that were true, and I don't believe that's true, I think it's an abuse of those biblical texts, but supposing it were true, does the fact that the earth has a limited life, a finite life, mean that we should not care for it? After all, our bodies are also doomed to perish, but we take good care of our bodies. We feed our bodies, we clothe our bodies. We spend a lot of money repairing our homes, even though we know that our homes are going to one day perish. People spend a fortune repairing their cars, and they know that their cars are not going to last forever. So those Christians who talk like this are really hypocrites, because they lavish so much time and so much money caring for things that are perishing. So if they do believe that this earth is perishing, that doesn't mean that they shouldn't care for it. The reason we care for the world is because God cares for the world. And if we truly love God, we should love the things that God loves. And if we don't love that which God loves, we cannot claim to be loving God. So let me conclude. When we engage in caring for creation along with non-Christians, and that's something we ought to be doing, because there are many non-Christians too who care about global warming, about climate change, about pollution, and so on. And yet there are some deep questions that we need to put to them even as we work with them. Robert Heilbronner, whom I quote here, was a well-known American economist. In a book written 40 years ago, he raises this troubling question. He says, what does it matter to me what life will be like in 2075, much less 3075? Why should I lift a finger to affect events that I will have no more meaning for me, which will have no more meaning for me 75 years after my death than those that happened 75 years before I was born? There is no rational answer to that terrible question. No argument based on reason will lead me to care for posterity or to lift a finger in its behalf. I suspect that if there is cause to fear for man's survival, it's because the calculus of logic and reason will be applied to problems where they have as little validity, even as little bearing, as the calculus of feeling or sentiment applied to the solution of a problem in Euclidean geometry. In other words, if a person is an atheist, why should he care what happens 100 years after his death? Supposing, yes, we don't address global warming effectively, the temperature of the earth rises, the human species disappears. Well, after thousands, millions of years, the process of evolution will throw up new life forms which can survive at higher temperatures. So why do we care? So that's a question, that's the kind of question we should be raising with our atheist friends who sadly care more about the future of the earth than many Christians do. And that, I believe, is the way that the gospel should go out. We work together with non-Christians on projects of shared common concern, but we raise these deeper philosophical questions. Why do you behave the way you do? Why do you care the way you do? And let's see how they respond. Here is a Christian organization that I've been involved with for many years. It's an international biodiversity conservation organization. This is their website, and you will find a lot of resources on their website that you can download and use in your churches to educate people about the care of creation. And here are two questions that I leave with you for you to reflect on in just a few minutes before Ajanta takes over and continues to talk about this subject. So just a couple of minutes of silence where you can reflect on these two questions that I leave with you.
All right, thank you, Vinod. We're done. Our next speaker is Ajanta Pereira, and she's possibly very well known to everyone here because she has been one of the few voices that have constantly spoken about garbage disposal and how that is impacting our environment for decades now in Sri Lanka. She is actually, in fact, one of the first people that I heard as a little child, and I'm happy to say that that was the start of my thinking about the environment as well. It's very young, and she has had immense influence, even putting in place state level programs, as well as beginning discussions around the nation on these issues of the environment, particularly garbage disposal, but also other environmental concerns that are connected to this. So she is going to speak to us today about some practical steps that we can take in implementing some lifestyle changes. Difficult for some of us to think or envision, So we are really glad to have someone who's had so much experience in the field. Thank you, Ajanta, for being with us. Over to you now.
Okay, I hope you can hear me well. All right, shall we pray before we start? Father God, I want to thank you for this time, dear Lord, that your children have gathered together to hear what you have to say about the environment and their responsibility. And Lord, we pray that you would touch their lives, touch their hearts, and open their eyes to see what they can do for their own country and for the world. So we leave, Father God, expecting for you to speak to us and also, Father, to enable us to do greater work for this country and for the world. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. And yeah, I like to thank you so much, and it's nice to be with you. Basically, I want to start by I really enjoyed Vinod's speech, and I want to say that when I talk about the biblical sense of things, that actually I come from a very different background, so my Christian knowledge is really has started really at the age of 20, when I really came to know that there is a God who has created this world. So my way of looking at God and the environment is really considering God to be the greatest scientist. In my environmental work, I look at God to be the greatest scientist who has created this world. Now, if we really look at the Bible, from what Vinod was talking about, the book of the Genesis, where how God created the world. When I look at it, there we see that God is a true scientist. Because if you really look at the Genesis chapter 1, and you start with verse 3, it talks about how God created light. Then in verse 6, it says God created air. And then it goes on to say in verse 9 that God created water. And verse 10, God has created land. 11, he has created plants. Verse 20, he has created animals. And then, of course, at last, in verse 28, he's talking about he has created man. And so why do I call God a great scientist? It's because if God has created the plants and then air and water and land, then of course we know there is something really wrong in the way that the world is created. Because the plants survive because they have light, they have air, they have water, and they have land. So without those things, the plants cannot survive. And so basically, because God is a scientist, because God is his creation is based on a scientific thinking, he has created exactly what the plants require before the plants were created. And I know this is something that you teach the children in the kindergarten. But unfortunately, even people who have PhDs have failed to understand this, because basically we look at God as a person who's sitting there, who has forgiven us and he has given us a new life. And we look at God as a being who's watching, he's taking care of us, but we never look at him as a scientist. And until and unless you look at him as a scientist, you would never be able to understand how beautifully he has created this world, and also what our responsibility is. I mean, for me personally, having a PhD on environmental science is absolute of zero value without the knowledge that God has given me, because he is the one who's really giving me the knowledge, the wisdom, the know-how, exactly day to day how to handle various issues that are within the world. So, that's the beauty of God. And then God creates animals, but before God creates animals, he has already created the plants. And we know the primary producers of food are the plants. So the plants, using light, using air, using water, carries out a process called photosynthesis, and because of that only we have food. And because we have food only, that animals can survive. Now, without the animals and the plants and the whole nutrient cycles in the world, the man cannot survive. So for man to survive, he needs plants, he needs animals, he needs the nutrient cycles, he needs the bacteria, he needs all the microorganisms for him to survive. But the beauty of God in science is that the amoeba, which is the smallest animal on earth, and man carries out the same functions but in a different way. Amoeba, being a unicellular, is one celled, man multicellular, totally complex, but both of our bodies carry out the same functions in order for us to survive. And this is so beautiful, this is so exciting, and this is where we understand why God has created this world in such a way that the man and the animals and the world, the plants, can survive together. Now, man has started to speak about development because the development is a necessity. Without development, we would not be able to survive on this earth. We need food, we need to buy food, we need to have jobs so that we can work and we can buy the food. We need to have education for survival so that we actually can get a job. So the whole process is there and it's called development. So we have a big word that's called development, and this is not only in Sri Lanka but all over the world. People go for development because development is something which is needed by the world. Now, what is our responsibility and how does a country actually run? Basically is every country has something called a constitution. We have a constitution, and according to the constitution, the whole purpose of the constitution is the protection of life. Now, in order to protect life of human beings in a given part of the world, you have so many policies which are developed. There are policies developed for economic development, policies on environment, policies on women and children. And so, everything that's carried out in a country is based on, it's arising from a constitution. Policies are there, frameworks are there, strategies are there, action plans are there. So everything is carried out. So a country is run by human beings, for human beings, utilizing the resources which we have, and so that the human life can be protected. Now, when you do these things, the most important thing is how faithful you remain for the protection of life of human beings and all around. But generally, people are very, let's say, very selfish. So they would always want to protect themselves. So at any cost. So here we have an issue where we need to ensure that all the policies that we have on environmental protection are agreed by the policies which we have on development. Because if the development policies do not agree with the environmental policies, then of course we will have an utter chaos of disruption to the natural resources. So I like to go through a few things that happens in Sri Lanka. And these are not new for you because you hear about these things every day on TV and all the issues that come up. So you know them, but let me take you through some of them. Now, for example, sand mining. This is a real problem in Sri Lanka that has existed for a long time. And sand mining is basically mining the sand for the purpose of construction. I mean, we need sand for construction. So someone to build a house, for someone to build a dam, for someone to build a harbor, whatever it may be, requires sand. And so sand is being mined. But when they mine the sand in such a way that they do not care about the banks and how the bank stability will be reduced, well, of course, this is going to create a problem. So all these things has to be regulated, and the permits has to be given in such a way that the mining would not be too much, so that the banks will be eroded and it might cause the landslides to occur. Now again, we need roads. So there's a lot of road development happening. Now everyone would prefer to have a comfortable life. And in order to have a comfortable life, you need to have road networks. And so we still hear on television in Sri Lanka where people are crying out for roads, and they say our children can't go to school, we can't get from A to B, and therefore we need roads. So when they are developing roads, now if you go especially to areas like Nuerelia and all those areas where you see the hilly areas, people are making roads by cutting into the hillsides, cutting into the mountains, cutting into the elevations. And so what happens eventually is, slowly that mountain, that elevation become unstable, and eventually you see landslides. But nevertheless, people still want roads because they want their life to be comfortable. Then we also have overfishing. Now people would want to eat, they want to eat fish. So somebody has to go out to the sea and actually do fishing. So when they go out to the sea to do fishing, of course they will be using boats, and the boats, when they are on their journeys, they will be spilling oil, and also they will be throwing garbage onto the sea. And not only that, they will be throwing nets so that they can get the best harvest. And so some of these nets, which are actually not even allowed, are being used, which are actually to catch more fish. So you get, if you use gill nets, then of course even the tiny little fish will get caught. If you use trawlers, of course the coral reefs will be damaged. But at the end of the day, these people are bringing fish because the people demand that they want to eat fish, and so they want them to catch the fish. So this is some problem that where it's the supply and demand issue, where the people want fish and so they catch it, but at the end of the day it does damage the oceanic environment. Now another issue that we have in our country, because we are an island, everyone is talking about the lack of land space. So what do they do now? When we look at the port city, how is the port city built? Port city is really built by pumping sand onto the land and actually putting up the construction, so that we have actually reclaimed the sea area. We have enlarged our land area. Now, how much of damage have we done to the ocean? The fish won't tell us. The living creatures of the oceans can't come take us to courts. So millions would have died, but nobody can talk about it, because as far as man is concerned, he's happy because he has an increased space, more land for man to do more constructions and develop. And so now again comes the question about cutting down the forest. Now we know very well, and we know also touch on that. When God created the plants, he created them for a purpose. The purpose is very simple in the sense of plants. A plant would take up carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. It would take up sunlight, would take water, and would produce using chlorophyll. The green plants would produce during photosynthesis food. Now, in turn, they give out oxygen and water vapor. Now, this is very simple science, and any kindergarten child knows about this. Now, a forest is different to having one plant. Forest is where you actually have this process happening 1,000 times over. So if rain comes to Sri Lanka, if you have plenty of rain for hydropower, if you have plenty of rain for drinking, for irrigation, for cultivation, for all the activities, it's because of the rain. And for rain, to enhance rain, we need to have forest. And our Singaraja forest is of value not because it looks beautiful so that the foreigners can bring some money for us. No, the Singaraja forest is important for us because it is the place which provides the highest amount of rainfall for us. And we need to understand that. But if the policies on development and policies on environment clash, then you would have a situation where somebody would go and say, no, I will build even a road, even a hotel inside the forest because I believe that is going to be economically, it will bring more revenue for the country. So, in a way, these are real environmental issues. And I think human beings, the more they become greedier, the more they think of their only lifespan, they will be taking decisions on certain things like this. Now, again, the farming community, just as much as the fishing community, the farming community too would want to have a better income. So what do? They use pesticides. And we all know that the pesticides are harmful to the person who's actually eating the vegetables and the fruits. And this is known world over. For example, I think as back as 1995, when I first did my research on the amount of pesticides in green leafy vegetables in Sri Lanka, I remember there were pesticide residues far above what the WHO standards are. But when I tried to speak about them, when I tried to show the people that that you need to be very careful with how you actually use pesticides in growing these crops, there were a lot of people who were objecting. They decided that they would not publish any of my work in their newspapers. They would not give me TV programs. They would not allow me to speak about them in seminars. So, but the thing is, we know very well, even though the farmers want to earn money, but if you use excess pesticides, even today, even as we are speaking, people are using insecticides and they're using high amounts of pesticides, all sorts of pesticides, which are even illegal in the world, and they're using it because they can get a better income. So it's all about responsibility. Then, of course, Ruth was talking about the garbage issues. I'm known as the garbage queen because I'm really happy that I actually went to the garbage dumps in order to find a solution for the garbage problem in Sri Lanka. Unfortunately, it's still not sorted out because we actually, the human beings, when we go shopping, we buy things which we want and we don't want. And mostly it's the packaging material. We have to buy those things. We can't buy fish without a tin. We can't buy, biscuits without a package. So basically the packing material has always become a problem. And so we have a huge amount of waste at home. And what people basically do is they give it to the local authority, and they give it to the local authority, and the local authority simply doesn't have a proper plans, and they do not we do not have recycling industries enough in Sri Lanka. We do not have enough of composting happening in Sri Lanka. We rather bring fertilizer from abroad. So eventually we have huge mountains of garbage in Vella, in Mitotamulla, Blumandal, at least they are closed at the moment, but they are still there. Then we have in Mutturajavela, then we have in Aruakkalu, and so it has created a whole amount of problems for the people because the smell of garbage and the microorganisms, the pathogenic organisms around, there are many issues. I don't even need to talk about those things. But even though I myself have actually written the solid waste management policy for Sri Lanka, unfortunately, they only need to implement it, and even that implementation is still not there because it's simply because when the garbage gets disposed at a dump site, a lot of people will get money for it because the amount of money that gets collected by the owners of the garbage disposal site is huge because they are charging per vehicle how much garbage is being brought. That's how they charge for the garbage. So if there are 10,000 metric tons of garbage gets collected every day, the amount of money that gets collected by the local authorities is huge, and then it gets divided among whoever is interested. So for recycling, if they really launch recycling in Sri Lanka, recycling industries in Sri Lanka, then all that, the revenue, the people would be separating the waste and the recycling industries would be making the money. So this is the problem why recycling is not supported up to now in Sri Lanka. And I remember very recently, I actually went to Karadiana and there's a huge garbage dump there, and I spoke to the people there whether they really still want to have that garbage dump site. And it's amazing how the people respond. I mean, sometimes I wonder whether they realize that they are going to live only for a short time. So basically, then we have an issue about the drinking water supply in Sri Lanka. I do not know whether you are aware that many parts of the world does not have drinking water. Many parts of Sri Lanka does not have drinking water. Anuradhapura, Monaragala, most of the people actually buy from bottles, and some people even add Ajinomoto to it so that it tastes better. So now comes the question, okay, all these issues are there. We have constitutions, we have policies, we have issues, but what do you do as a Christian? This is the problem. But you can never act on these things until and unless you have realized that God is the greatest scientist. He is calling you, he's speaking to you through the Bible as a scientist, and he's asking you to be responsible. And I know I've been speaking for years about the garbage issues and so on, and you know about how you need to separate, make other things out of the waste material. But the important thing today, what I want to leave with you is, how much damage have you done to this world during your lifetime? In which ways have you disrupted the natural resources of Sri Lanka during your lifetime? Can you really sit down and kneel down and pray before God and ask God for things when you know very well the thing that is closest to Him is His own creation, which He has given to us to take care of? But have we really done our part? This is very, very important, because very often I still see in churches people are using shopping bags. I still see people using lunch sheets. They're using plastic cups. They're using plastic plates at functions. And very often the trees are cut down because they want to develop their car park of the church. Or when they build a church, what do? They actually cut the trees first and they develop the plan. So, it's sometimes it's very, very difficult, because you can talk to the church community and tell them that you need to become responsible every day. But it's between you and God. And you know exactly what you're supposed to do and what you're not supposed to do. But very often you look at the people around and you say, why should I be different. You know, and this is the problem that we have. Why should I be different? Well, there is a reason why you need to be different. It's because you are created for a purpose, and that purpose is to do what God is expecting from your life. From the time that you were conceived by your mother in her womb, God has a plan for your life. And that plan is supposed to be in order to be in tune with God, what He's expecting from the world. And when God says very clearly, love thy neighbor as yourself, you need to understand, if we really love the world, if we really love our neighbor, we will live in such a way that it will be beneficial to the neighbor, it will be beneficial to the country. And more than anything else, God has given you a voice to speak. And many Christians think it's unholy to be speaking, it's unholy to be protesting, it's unholy to be standing on a stage and speak against what is wrong. But the Lord has already given you a voice, but He has also given you a brain and wisdom. And I think God is expecting us so tremendously to use our voice, to use our hands, our brains, and our eyes to do His will. But we can always give excuses. And I think up to now, as a person who has come to believe in God at the age of 20, coming from a different religious background, I really want to say that I'm so disappointed, because God has given you so much, and yet the majority of the Christians are very quiet. And I think time has come for you to be acting. Don't criticize others. Don't blame things on others. Look at yourself in the mirror and take decision, not tomorrow, but today. Thank you so much for inviting me. I hope that I didn't hurt you, but God is watching you and He wants changes. And the only person who can bring that change is you. So you need to look at your own self. Thank you.
Thank you, Ajanta. Thank you for speaking. Next speaker for this morning is Ravi Agama. He's a lawyer, and some of you may know him as one of the founders of the Environmental Foundation Limited. They are an NGO that works with environmental concerns, and particularly, they work particularly with litigation. And we hope that Ravi will bring some of his experiences in the field into today's talk. He will be covering how the legal perspective on the environment and environmental conservation issues, and will be also approaching it obviously from a Christian perspective, because that is one of these motivations. So we welcome Ravi to come and speak to us.
Thank you, Ruth. And thank you to the Graduate Christian Fellowship for inviting me to be a resource person in this seminar. The Graduate Christian Fellowship will pardon me if I start with a tribute to Buddhism. The protection of creation, at least in our part of the world, has an Eastern flavor, particularly stemming from the influence of Buddhism, a religion which was seen as teaching kindness to animals. We have authentic evidence of this. We have a fifth pillar edict of Emperor Asoka in India, carved on stone some about 2,400 years or 2,350 years ago. In this inscription, the emperor says he lists birds, beasts such as rhinoceros, monkeys, the Barasingha deer, and fish and insects. It was further ordained that forests must not be burned either for mischief or to destroy living creatures. With the establishment of Buddhism in Sri Lanka, shortly after 250 years before Christ, it became a royal prerogative to perform various acts which enabled Buddhism to spread in this country. Among these was the renewal of laws which gave protection to animals, again borne out by ancient inscriptions in Sri Lanka. A good example is the 12th century edict of King Trinkamali, ordering by beat of drum that no animals should be killed within a radius of 7 leagues of the city of Anuradhapura. He gave security to animals, security to the fish in the 12 great tanks, as they were called, and also security to birds. These were the sanctuaries of old. This fine tradition in this country, which enabled animal populations to flourish, even when Sri Lanka, or Ceylon as we then called it, was the granary of the East, was unfortunately broken during years of European occupation. The Portuguese, the Dutch, and the greater part of the British period. There was no legal protection for the denizens of the forest, but the introduction of guns and ammunition and a euphemism called sport, which set in motion a kind of animal slaughter that we are still ashamed of in this country. So much for the background, friends, Christian friends and non-Christian friends. Today, the environment, or if we talk of the natural environment, animals and plants, ultimately which will include human beings, is protected in 2 ways. One is particularly by a piece of legislation called the Fauna and Flora Protection Ordinance, which lists a hierarchy of protected areas. It lists protected areas in which animals and plants are free to evolve at their own pace with minimum interference by human beings. And second, it lists animals and plants which are protected, that is, the destruction of which will carry certain penalties. So now, if you take these 2 ways together, if it's a protected area, every animal will be protected, whether in an outside area, whether they would be unprotected or not. For instance, a wild pig is not a protected species under the 2nd category, but certainly within a protected area, they will receive protection. Protected areas, I told you, have a hierarchy, the highest being a strict nature reserve. Examples such as Hakgala, a part of the landscape between the Manikganga and the Kumbukangoya, just passing Yala, between Yala and Kumana, and also Ritigala, a lone mountain in the north central province, strangely in the dry zone, which is always covered in mist at the higher elevation. The 2nd category will be the national parks, to which people are welcome and people can enter on permits subject to certain rules and regulations. A strict nature reserve, the highest category, is as it were a holy of holies, and no human appearance is tolerated. Humans can enter it only for 2 reasons. One is for research, which is approved by the Department of Wildlife, That is not their own research, but a research which will establish a widely applicable precedent for conservation in Sri Lanka. And secondly, it for departmental purposes, to see that these areas are protected. There are later nature reserves, jungle corridors, sanctuaries. I may just mention that sanctuary is the only category at that level which can occur on private land as well as state land. All the other categories above sanctuaries can only be designated on state land. So when I came into the law school in 1979, and we were in a band of like-minded students who used to constantly be climbing mountains or in the rugged outdoors virtually every other weekend. And we realized and we listed out almost 90 statutes in Sri Lanka which dealt with some part of the environment or the other and its conservation. But many of these were only being observed in the breach, and what is worse, were not even known to the agencies that were entrusted to protect them. That's the reason why the seed was planted in our minds, in our young student minds, that even though we had a rich heritage of voluntary organizations, we had a 100-year-old wildlife and nature protection society, we had for specialized groups, for trees we had Rukrakagannu, we had the Sri Lanka Marine Association, we had a Natural History Society as old as anything from 1912, or is it 1812? I'm just wondering, maybe one of those. So the problem was there was no organization on the Sri Lankan scene to actively promote the environmental conservation by means of recourse to law and legal provisions. And therefore we thought a new group would be necessary, and we had it incorporated as the Environmental Foundation Limited, without the use of the word limited. It was a company limited by guarantee, but with a share capital. And we started enlisting members who were actually shareholders, and that was the start of a public interest law group in this country. Incidentally, it was the first one in Asia at the time. It was modeled closely on the lines of Greenpeace, Sierra, Friends of the Earth, and another group called the Natural Resources Defense Council in the United States. We took on many cases due to time constraints. I will only have to just rush through these. First case was in Galway National Park, which is a 100-square-mile national park, which provides the catchment for the Senanayaka Samudra. We have only 2 tanks which are so large that they are called a sea. The one is the Senanayaka Samudra, the other, you will guess, is the Parakrama Samudra. So this national park had a large extent in an adjacent sanctuary, actually a part of the park, called the Baduluwela Reserve, encroached by supporters of the then newly come MP for that area. And when the Wildlife Department filed a case against these encroachers in the national park, there was a suggestion to settle the cases or to compound these cases in the Monoragala Magistrates Court. That is, by giving right to the people to collect the harvest of the next season and to vacate the park. People might have thought that was a very innocent and a very well-meaning decision, but we realized that unless there was a conviction under the Fauna and Flora Protection Ordinance, there was no mechanism under law to evict these people. So they would have given that undertaking to court and stayed there forever, and maybe they would have happily gone to jail for a month or 3 months the most for an offense of contempt of court. Even that was unlikely, and then they would have stayed here for the rest of their lives. We came to the Court of Appeal, we supported an application for writ, and we got a stay order on the magistrate of Monaragala from compounding these cases until this matter was heard in the Court of Appeal. Of course, as you know, there is a big delay in cases at appellate level, and by the time this case came up, all those cases had resulted in convictions and the people were thrown out of the park. That was our first experience in litigation. Of course, I must mention that the standing to sue, or what is called locus standi, the lawyers amongst you will know what I mean. It was extremely difficult to convince the judges in Hulsdorf. At that time, the Environmental Foundation functioned from a room in my own house. And this organization, which was in Navala Road, Rajagiriya, what is the interest in Galway or Monaragala or there? Why are they bothered about something that happens so far away? It was difficult to say we are all part of the environment. And it was in some of our early cases, our counsel had been on their feet for an hour or an hour and a half merely to establish standing to sue. The second case was Karagang Levaya, which now is academic because the southern harbor is housed exactly in that Levaya. When they tried to convert it to a commercial salter, the Siddhalepa group, we got an order from court stopping that on the basis that this was an ill-planned development program. And by that time, the third case was also in the pipeline, the Hakgala Strict Natural Reserve case. In the Hakgala Strict Nature Reserve, mind you, I said the Holy of Holies, the highest degree of protection for any area. People had encroached to grow potatoes, and 2,000 acres out of 4,000 had been already cleared, all with the patronage of the local politician. And when we came to court, we asked when there was a wildlife ranger who was brave enough to file cases in the circuit court at Valimada against these people, they could not serve summons for 2 years. Every court date there is a summons returnable comment saying can't be found, the house is locked and padlocked and there's no one around. The neighbors say there is no such person. How can there be neighbors in a strict nature reserve? They should have also been arrested by the police. But that was the way cases were going on till, as a result of our case, the department was issued a writ of mandamus to prosecute these cases diligently up to judgment, and we were able to evict all those people from this important watershed area of Sri Lanka. There are many other cases. The coal power plant in Trinkamali was another example where these cases this was fought under the Coast Conservation Act, which had a primitive form of an environmental impact assessment. Actually, that was in 1981. That was the first statute in Sri Lanka which mentioned an environmental impact assessment, which I will deal with a moment later. And we managed to show that the government of the day intended to bring a substandard power plant, which Sweden had retired after 30 years of use, and house it in Sri Lanka in the worst possible place in Trinkamali, in a beautiful area which was in the harbor of Trinkamali. And for 6 months of the year, the plume of polluted gas would have flown across Sri Lanka, especially in our tea gardens and even beyond. I say this because the plume of polluted gas would have resulted because that, I said, a substandard power plant. It didn't have scrubbers, it didn't have cooling mechanisms. Even the water that was, the heated water, was to be discharged into a narrow space of sea called the French Pass. And no study done on the marine life, how it would affect the livelihood of hundreds of people who depended on fishing, on prawn farming or prawn fishing in that area. So that was, fortunately in that case, the Coast Conservation Director disallowed the EIA, the faulty EIA that was done. The Galle Face Green was to be leased to the private sector, which EFL petitioned court, and we managed to stop it, going to the EAP group of companies to be managed and run. Then, of course, the Kamdalama Hotel, some of you know the issues that were involved due to time constraints. I won't be able to deal with all the details of it, except to say that it was the first time a hotel was being located in a catchment of a tank. So one of the chief defenses was that Kamdalama tank now gets water from the Maharali scheme, and therefore the word catchment is only of academic interest. But we were able to show that the only function of a catchment is not to catch water, but prevention of siltation is one of the biggest functions of a catchment, and many other things. And of course, the government of the day, the president of the day, with the tourism minister of the day were so powerful. They bent the law, and they did things which were totally unfair by Sri Lanka, and the hotel was built whilst even an inquiry was proceeding in the Land Commissioner's Department based on our case. They worked 3 shifts and completed 90% of the construction during the 6 weeks that we were going through with this inquiry under the Land Development Ordinance. In the Eppavala phosphate mining case, EFL did the case in the name of 7 of the farmers of that area. The Supreme Court, in fact, stretched the principle of public guardianship. What we said, we are only trustees, that they even took the argument further. Justice A.R.B. Amarasinghe, and he gave an extremely well reasoned and a salutary judgment which favors environmental conservation. In more recent times, even though there is an old road through Vilpattu, the old Mana Road, the government of the day used the navy while Vilpattu was closed to the public on the basis that it's heavily mined and the public were not allowed in. They cut 2 further roads. In fact, one road was 100 meters wide, 100 feet wide and 70 kilometers. You can imagine the amount of timber, unaccounted for timber that was used, that was extracted from this area. So much so that when we filed action and when we got a stay order on usage of this road, the respondents were not even interested at that time. Some people even alleged that an election campaign of the time was conducted merely on the money of the timber from this road at Vilpattu. So the same thing could be the situation in Singharaja. already during in this, though there is a road from Nelua to Kalavana, this new road that was with no environmental concerns cut through the Sinharaja forest, connecting a village called Lanka. Perhaps later it might happen that they would not have any interest because already they have got what they wanted from the area. I will only deal with yeah, I think I have a few minutes more. An environmental impact assessment is a new concept in Sri Lanka, which is really, an EIA is like a prophecy. You are projecting what effects could be harmful, could be beneficial effects a proposed project will have in 25 years, in 50 years, in 75 years. And if there are any harmful effects on the environment, how they can be mitigated at an early stage or when planning the project itself. So therefore, it is going to be extremely useful. All I need to say is now there is a way for the public to intervene directly in the decision-making process, because EIAs, when they are published in newspapers or in the Gazette and saying these are available at these places for public comments, open for public comments, the public will be able to make their intervention in relation to these projects, and the government is mandated to take these into effect. Mandated, of course, in keeping with the political climate that prevails at the time. As you know, we are living in Sri Lanka, and things need not necessarily happen as according to the books. But at least we can be proud that we have a provision in our law which, even in theory, allows the public to engage with the government and with developmental agencies in the decision-making process of the government. I thank you for your patient hearing.
Thank you very much, Ravi. Thank you for those enlightening insights into the litigation involved with environmental concerns. We are going to, now that all three of our speakers are finished presenting their ideas, thank you. Some of you, I saw you sent in questions. Please keep them coming. I will now hand over to Amal Kumarage, who will moderate the Q&A session. Amal Kumarage is the chairperson of GCF, but he is also outside known for his work in engineering, particularly in transport. He has worked alongside many ministries and setting up bodies and participating in policy making, some of which has also been environmental conservation has been part of a concern in transport sector development as well. So handing over to him now. Please keep your questions coming in. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruth, and a very good morning to everybody. And also thank you to all three speakers who have, I think, given much food for thought. And I look forward to receiving your comments. We have about half an hour to engage the speakers to probe deeper into what they have said. During the last 1.5 hours, we have been taken through, you know, what the environment is and how we should respond to what is happening around us. I think some time ago there was an advertisement or some kind of radio spot called Parisareta Mohotak. In other words, saying, you know, give a moment to look at the environment. And what we've heard over the last 1 hour or so is something like that. Since the environment may not directly affect us on a day-to-day basis. It's something that we've got to pause to think about. And there are many such things. And I'm pleased that a lot of different reasons why we should think about it have been thrown up by our speakers. So Vinod in particular laid a very strong biblical basis for us as Christians to not only be interested, but to be actively engaged in what is happening around us in terms of the created environment that God has entrusted to us. Issues of development and conservation are often pitted against each other, and often you need to have some kind of strong basis to separate the pros and the cons of these. Dr. Ajanta took us through a lot of instances where the fallen nature of mankind, wherever man lives in whichever part of the globe, continues to engage in wanton destruction of this created world, way exceeding our needs and our requirements. And I think we do need to go into, and there was a question on, what are the practical things that, we here in Sri Lanka, particularly as graduates who are Christian and wanting to apply what we believe in professional life can do about our environment. And then, of course, Ravi took us through a very interesting journey, a personal journey of his engagement in protecting the environment, particularly the natural environment, the forest reserves, the strict natural reserves across Sri Lanka. And I think a story that should encourage us, and particularly our younger people, to think of how we could do similar things, taking after our passion and and things like that. One of the questions that Vinod posed was actually about even our hobbies. How does your daily work, hobbies, and habits demonstrate God's love and care for the world? So I think we have a lot to think about today, and there are several questions, and I would like all the speakers to come back on screen if you can, so that we can go through the questions. Right. So the questions are there. I think you can also read them in the chat box. And there are 4 questions that we can look at in the first round. One question to Ajanta to speak of some practical ideas, both on the personal front, like in families, what we can do, and as well as in the communities we belong to, our workplaces, our churches, and amongst friends or whatever. Maybe a few things that you can share. Then also from Teva Sagayam, we have the question there. The developed countries have done the damage in the past. Environmental concerns are stifling the development of developing countries. Our youth are unemployed. We have social and ethnic issues. There's so much inequality. When you are well off and comfortable, you can think of environment. What do you say about this issue? How do you make the developed countries accountable? I'll direct that to Vinod to try and have a first round go. And to Ajanta again, I'll add that on the practical issues. To Ravi from Ruth, in the example of people who had encroached on the nature reserve, how do we balance the needs, protection of the environment, and with what people see as very immediate needs? Yeah, how do we, again, something like Theosagam's question, but at a more human level, how do you look at it? Then what else? You can pick up any of the other questions that are following rather than my directing. So if you read them, feel free to pick up. So if we can go in the same order, Vinod, the first round we'll do it that way. Vinod, if you can take a couple of minutes to answer that question, followed by Ajanta and then by Ravi. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Amar. Yeah, there are two assumptions in Theosagam's question which we have to challenge. First, that it's when we are well off and comfortable only we start thinking about the environment. That is simply not true. I think the majority of those who are well off and comfortable in Sri Lanka or in the US or in Europe actually don't give a damn about the environment. And the people who are most concerned today in the West are actually the young people, because they see their futures as being eroded by the practices followed by their elders. Another assumption is that somehow the requirements of development and the requirements of caring for creation contradict each other. Well, yes, sometimes there has to be a trade-off, but most often the policies that actually protect the environment also enhance economic development. It all depends on what model of development we are talking about. And I think one of the tragedies of countries like Sri Lanka is that although we are late on the sort of development stage, we are not using that as an opportunity to learn from the mistakes that so-called developed countries have made. We are blindly following policies that have just been handed down to us. And so many of us identify development with sort of more cars on our roads, more highways, 6-lane highways, skyscrapers. You know, we look at Colombo, we see all these tall buildings, most of which are empty. And we think, now we are a developed city. Now, where do we get these models of development from? Don't our engineers and our economists and our bureaucrats and our politicians have more imagination to rethink what we mean by development? And like I said earlier, the biblical understanding of sustainable development, development that is equitable, that benefits all of society, development that actually passes on to the next generation a richer world than we found it. Now, this is the kind of development that we should be imagining and advocating. And when you think of global warming, remember, global warming is not just an environmental issue, it's a social justice issue. Because the people who are suffering most from the effects of climate change are not the rich, it's the poor. That's why we have so many environmental refugees. We have people in the Maldives, in the Pacific Islands, who are going to lose their nations because of the rich lifestyles, not just of people in Europe and America, but also people in India, in Sri Lanka, in Malaysia, Thailand, and so on. The rich social elites, our lifestyles actually are harming the poor. And so this is a social justice issue and not simply an environmental issue. So I think we should just challenge these false dichotomies between development on the one hand and caring for the environment on the other.
Thank you, Vinod. Ajanta? Ajanta? Your mic.
The host has to unmute.
Yeah. Basically, it's it's calculating your carbon footprint. We all know that very fact that we are breathing in oxygen and we are breathing out carbon dioxide explains to us very well who a human being is. We are giving out carbon dioxide, which is the very gas that is actually harming the whole world and causing greenhouse, we call it a greenhouse gas, and leads to global warming. So what we need to do is to calculate our carbon footprint. Now, one of the very easy things that you can understand is the very best way that you can get rid of the carbon dioxide is to plant a tree. So for your birthday, every birthday, plant a tree. But not only simple that, but what you need to understand is that even in Genesis 1:28, when God says for us to rule over, he does not say that we should rule over the plants. You should, if you really read that Bible verse very well, 1:28 Genesis, it says we can rule over the fish, the animals, the birds in there, but it does not say that we need to rule over the plants, because the plants are the primary producers for the whole life. And so we can't rule over it. We need to be planting. The land is given by God for planting, but instead we go and build the biggest house possible. Even if you are in business, we build the biggest company possible. Even the churches, I have to say, we build the biggest church possible. And if you go to the churches, most of the garden is concrete. Very little space is available for planting a tree. And most is taken for car parks. So we need to calculate our carbon footprint. In the morning, you get up, you use a toothbrush to brush your teeth, you look in the mirror, they use a toothpaste, and what do you do with the container? Then you go into eat, and then it's adds on. Then you get into your vehicle. You might be going on with one journey. You may be able to go to several places, but because you have not planned it properly, you may be going all over the place. And then the amount of water that you are utilizing. Do you utilize rainwater? Do you do home gardening? There are many questions. Then do you take a plastic bag when you take your own bag or use bag when you're going shopping, or do you have a cloth bag? Do you accept the shopping bags from the grocery store? And then what kind of packaging material do you buy? Every time you buy a pair of shoes, do you also ask for a box, or do you simply bring it in your own bag? So there are questions. So what we call as a carbon footprint, you need to calculate it. And each individual human being needs to do that. As a family, you can do that. And one of the most important thing is, if you cannot do these projects on your own, every church should have their environmental policy. I actually have drawn up an environmental policy for the Methodist Church. We actually developed a recycling program inside the Methodist Church. Some are functioning well, some are not functioning so well, but nevertheless, we need to have an environmental policy for our church. And then we also need to have an environmental group within the church. It's exciting for young people to get together and calculate the carbon footprint, and then to say, okay, let's do something about this. And we always talk about evangelism. Evangelism is a very important part of church life. But very often, when we go and want to speak to other people in our community, we can talk about the environment. We can start our conversation with the environment. We can develop environmental projects with our community. We don't have to always work with the Christians. We have to work with everyone, because it matters how we all live together. So, there are many things to do, but it has to begin with you. And I would suggest that you would calculate your carbon footprint. Each one who has been in this session today, why don't you just sit and calculate your carbon footprint? How much damage have you already done? How much damage can you reduce? Now take that together with the other good news, your good news. Go to church, develop an environmental policy, develop a group, and begin your work. And I'm sure you'll have fun, and more than that, God will guide you. And that's a fantastic thing.
Thank you, Ajanta. I think two strong messages there. Calculate your carbon footprint, and I believe there are lots of sites that you can use to calculate your own the damage you do to the environment, right, on the internet. And I wonder whether you're in a position to even share for somebody who wants to have a look at the policy that you have developed for the Methodist Church. If anybody wants, so maybe you can contact her.
Yes, it's available.
Okay,
Sure.
thank you. So move on to Ravi. Maybe Ravi, you can also try to answer Ramona's question about the principles you apply when you take up a case, and why is there such a lull in litigation today when actually the problem seems to be even worse than when, the time that you got engaged. Ravi, over to you.
Firstly, the question from Ru. Sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah. Yes, we can.
Firstly, the question from Ruth: how do we balance ourselves when it comes to a case of encroachment? The simple answer is we don't even have to balance. The 12, first of all, I should have dealt with this in my 25 minutes allocated to me, but unfortunately, some of you may know that I do 30 hours of environmental law in the University of Sabaragamu at its Buttala campus, and I think I telescoped 30 hours into less than 30 minutes for this presentation today. So naturally, I have left out chunks. So 12.5% of Sri Lanka's land area is directly dedicated to the conservation of wildlife. It comes directly under the Department of Wildlife, which is actually a very high index for a developing country or even a developed country. There are very few countries which can claim as high a percentage as our country, thanks to the foresight of previous political regimes, including the latter part of the British government, when we were a colony. But that means straight away that there is 87.5% left of our country for people to engage in their programs, in their activities. So therefore, why should we, in the case of Galway, it was fervently argued that let them take their cultivations. What is the problem about cultivations? Our simple answer was, how many organizations are there at governmental level, including an agriculture department, an agrarian services department, you name it, there are so many agencies which are there on the side of cultivation and cultivators. But why should the government, through the wildlife department, also try to take in the interest of cultivation when their sole duty is to protect the integrity of the areas that are designated as protected areas? So that is the reason why I say that we cannot balance this area. At least it is not, in my opinion, our task to balance it. Having said that, the pressure will be very large on certain areas of our parks. For instance, I'm thinking of Udawalawe, where part of the park is in fairly good irrigated and arable land, whereas there are a lot of protected areas in which people may not be that interested in going and starting cultivations or monocultures or things that are there in those areas. But some of these areas, it will be even in Wasgamua, that has been an election promise for the last 15-20 years, that if I come into power, I will excise 5,000 hectares acres from the Wasgamua Park and hand over to the villagers of Andungamua and Hettipola and those areas for cultivation. So sometimes it's the political will of the time. Sometimes environmentalists are hitting themselves against a sort of a blank wall, as it were, but ultimately it is a partnership between government, the politicians, and activists and environmentalists, which will bring out the best in a situation like that. On the question of Ramona about principles on which cases are taken, EFL, I can't speak of all the other organizations, but as for the organization which I co-founded, EFL, we were careful in taking cases which have the capacity to establish widely applicable precedents for the future. Sometimes the question is not taking on every battle on environment that you see or that you hear, or if you open the newspaper that you read about. The question of what battles you take is an extremely important decision, because we cannot spread ourselves too thin on fighting on all fronts at this time. So therefore, the principles are mainly that the principles which will have a widely applicable precedents. Right to information when there was no Right to Information Act, like the Galway Center lease case, then about the integrity of protected areas and how you cannot encroach on those areas, however well connected you might be, about even when there was no EIA provisions for the entire island, and it was only there for the coastal strip, we took up these cases on the basis that their impacts do not justify the projects. Then about citing hotels in catchments and other vulnerable areas of our water, of our reservoirs, and of course whether one should engage multilateral multinational organizations with a checkered history when it comes to exploit a national treasure like Eppavala phosphate mine. So taking up the cases, what cases you would take up is also an important decision. Thank you.
Ravi, thank you. There was also this question from Ramona, why there doesn't seem to be adequate challenges today. People seem to have just rolled over and allowed things to happen, often blaming the politicians of blatantly, disregarding the law. I mean, we see a lot of exposure in the media, but there doesn't seem to be adequate civil society response, professional response. I mean, is it given up now, or have people given up?
Okay, I can handle it. Thank you, Amal. The question is, it ultimately boils down to the people at the apex of governmental organization and the political atmosphere that prevails at any given time. Now, just to come to the recent events, it could be a road through Sinharaja today. The next week, it will be clearing of a large extent of land in Anevilundava, a Ramsar Convention protected wetland, one of the few in this country. The following week, it will be Vanathavillu. The next week, it will be Monaragara. So sometimes things are done in an organized way in which when the people, everyone knows the advocacy against these projects is limited and coming from few organizations, and they cannot, when they are dealing with one matter, three more issues come up which are as serious. So this way, sometimes people, the activists may seem to be powerless, may seem to be not reacting, but it does not mean that whether it's on the legal front, whether it's filing applications in court, things are happening, but sometimes not fast enough as the destruction goes on. Thank you.
Okay. Certainly, I mean, the impression we get is we are losing the battle by hearing about how fast the forest cover is depleting and our air quality is deteriorating and so on. So yeah, thank you for your thoughts. I would like to open the mic now if anybody wants to ask a quick question. You prefer to ask it verbally than put it in on the chat. Just open your mic and speak. The floor is yours. Okay. While that happens, I have here an offer from Priyan Dias to show a couple of slides on carbon footprint calculation that he has with him. So Priyan, if we really don't have much time, if you can do that in 2 minutes, you're welcome to share your screen. Amalan, maybe you can facilitate that. Amalan?
Yeah, Klamal, I think,
yeah. Okay, thank you. Yes, Priyan. Priyan? Priyan, we can't hear you.
Okay, can I be heard?
Yeah, now, yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can I be heard?
Yes, Priyan, we can hear you.
Okay, okay, right, okay. So this is some work that I happen to get involved in. Basically looking at some data for different countries. So on this y-axis, we have what is called the ecological footprint per capita. So that is, people talked about carbon footprint. Now, ecological footprint is something slightly more comprehensive, I think. It is measured in terms of the number of global hectares every person is consuming or occupying, right? And the sustainable number of global hectares that any single individual can have is apparently 1.7 global hectares. Now we can see that Sri Lanka is just within that box and also happens to have a high human development index. And there is one of these websites, which I don't know how true, it lists Algeria, Colombia, Cuba, Ecuador, Georgia, Jamaica, Jordan, and Sri Lanka as being the only countries that satisfy both a low ecological footprint and high human development index. So maybe we can be happy and build with it. The bad news, of course, is that, you know, most of the countries and the world is having an ecological footprint far in excess of what the world can sustain. So I am in any case naturally pessimistic by nature, and where the environment is concerned, it's a very bleak picture. If at all we can think, somebody mentioned about, you know, being rich and then only you will start looking at the environment. There seems to be this kind of downturn, you know. Basically what this is saying is that if you want a high human development index, I mean good, looking forward to a good life, good education, then your ecological footprint is also going to increase. Perhaps it might decrease after a certain point. It looks like Singapore, Israel, Japan, you know, they are perhaps having a lower ecological footprint after reaching a particular human development index. But, you know, for this curve, I mean, there are various controversies about doing polynomials for this kind of data and things like that. But the two messages I want to say is, okay, we have a natural advantage that we can try to preserve and build on, but it's a drop in the bucket. It's a drop in the ocean where the rest of the world is concerned. So I will stop there. Right. Thanks.
Thank you, Priyan. Thank you. While it's sort of reassuring, I think, it also highlights that we are definitely following the upward trajectory. So there's much to be done. Thank you, Priyan, for putting that up. I think we've come to the final couple of minutes. I just want to give 1 minute each to all the three speakers again to pick up any question that has been posted in the chat box, and we'll start with Vinod, Ajanta, and Ravi to conclude.
Well, I answered on the chat box Elijah's question. And I think what I would say to people who are asking for practical suggestions is, why don't you develop one area of personal interest, something you are convinced about, develop your passion, study it. It could be plastics, it could be climate change, it could be energy use, whatever it may be. And then think of what you can do in that area, along with other people whom you contact who share your passion, and just work on that. Otherwise, you can just get lost in this vast ocean of problems. Just identify one issue that has caught your imagination, that engages your heart, and actually spend the rest of your life working on that area.
Thank you, Ajanta. Any closing thoughts while answering some of the questions? Ajanta, you need to unmute your mic. Ajanta, you need to unmute your mic. Amalan, can you unmute her?
Okay, I think now you should be able to hear me, right?
Yes.
All right. I know, listening to one of the speakers, I was a little saddened because, Sri Lanka is a very poor country. I think for people who are living in Colombo, who may be earning a bit of money, they don't realize how poor the people are in rural parts of Sri Lanka. If you go to the estates, people don't even have enough water to drink. They don't even get water. They only get water twice every week. There are so many people who do not even have toilet facilities. There's a vast amount of problems in Sri Lanka. So developmental work will have to go on in Sri Lanka. We are not a developed country. And so the question comes is, of course, the governments that are going to come, that are here today, everybody's going to make a mistake. As I said, the constitution has allowed policies to be developed so that the governments know how to develop, but some are a little stubborn, so things can go wrong. But development has to happen in Sri Lanka. But the question that I have is for the church. The church is very quiet in many of the major issues of Sri Lanka. They say they'll pray about it. And I see a lot of churches getting together to pray. But there is more than prayer. If you see a lion coming, you don't just stand and pray, but you run while you are praying. So that you have to have the same tactic. You need to be praying while you are also acting. And I want to really bring back this question about the 20th Amendment. No church even spoke about it. And Singaraja Forest, no church spoke about it. So the question is, I want to challenge every Christian is, do your part. As much as you also have to take care of the environment about how you live. But when it comes to major issues of the country, the church must respond. The God has given us so much power. He has given us everything that we need. He has given us wisdom and intelligence, but we are not using it for the national use. And I think time has come for church to not only just pray, but also act. And I think this is very important because we need to accept the fact that Sri Lanka is still a very poor country and we need to develop it. And we need to develop together with the governments that come, but at the same time, making sure that we contribute it in a very positive way. Thank you.
Thank you, Ajanta. And I think certainly we need to be aware of the development options, and there are often waves of effort to take utilities to people. I often wonder whether it should be the other way around, where we should relocate people to where the utilities are. I mean, there's so much talk these days of getting water to everybody, but I think at least in some cases, I think we need to take people to where the water is. Sri Lanka is one of the least urbanized countries. And what's happening is actually the whole country is, ad hocly being urbanized. And I think these are some of the issues that we need to look at. Ravi, the last slot is yours.
Thank you, Professor Amal.
Can you speak a little louder, please?
Yes. Is that okay?
Yes, it is.
One of the questions from Sumati Rajasingham is about the issues being so big for our small acts to make any difference. I would encourage you to do your small acts, because it is the resultant force of many small acts together which ultimately will either motivate other people or result in a bigger thrust in favor of protection of the heritage that we have. I'll just quickly run through two examples. One is an orchestra. There is a little flute called the piccolo. And once the piccolo player thought, what am I doing here with all the flutes, with all the strings, the violins, the violas, the double bass, everybody was blaring out, the trumpets, and he just kept the piccolo to his mouth but didn't play. Within seconds, the orchestra was stopped by the conductor. The conductor shouting, "Where is the piccolo? Where's the piccolo?" To the person who mattered most in that situation, the conductor, it was noticed, though the piccolo player thought it was insignificant. In another seaside scape, there's a particular kind of sea creature that gets washed up for the tide, and sometimes it comes too far out that they die out because they cannot survive outside the water. And there was this boy who was walking along the beach. Each time he saw one of them, he used to pick it up and throw it back at the water. A person coming from the other direction asked, what difference can you make? All the millions of these animals that are getting washed ashore and dying, you're taking a few and throwing back, what difference? While listening to him, he picked up another of those creatures, and while throwing it into the water, he said, at least to that fellow, it made a difference. So never underestimate the power of your little actions that you could be making. There was one other question about what about the human-animal conflicts. The human-animal conflicts, please be aware, are created by human beings, not by animals. Because as Vinod said earlier on that this is the human impact on the non-humans in this world. If you place a sugarcane plantation in Palavatta, directly in an elephant corridor, you are naturally inviting a human-elephant conflict. If you take peacocks from the wild and start rearing them in temples and other places, and they escape, they have become a huge problem. Then if you start fragmenting land for your housing projects, and now the wet zone monkeys don't have the purple-faced langurs or purple-faced leaf monkeys, they don't have really places where they could go and have their food. So therefore they come into home gardens, smaller gardens. They even sometimes steal items from homes. So it's always the humans who are responsible for the human-animal conflicts. and solutions to these conflicts must come from humans in a way that meets the needs of the animals who were the original inhabitants of these areas. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ravi. I think a strong message there. We have to bring this program to a close. We have the GCF AGM starting in 10 minutes. Thank you very much to the panelists for keeping the Q&A session very active, very informative. And I hope that all of you who participated by asking questions had answers. Thank you for your questions also. In terms of, getting some piccolos together, Ravi, the GCF has something called interest groups. That is, anybody who is interested, we will link them up so that they can share their interest, say what they are doing, and try to collaborate in, doing whatever they can together, encouraging people maybe. So those of you who have joined in today, if any of you want to be part of an environmental interest group, please put your name or say yes on the chat, and we can get somebody from the GCF committee to take leadership and make a group out of you. It's entirely up to the group to decide what you want to do. So if there are enough people, so some little thing that you can be part of if you feel that, you have a little piccolo or a violin or something you can bring in to make a bit of a noise. So thank you, everybody, and over to you, Ruth, to close the program.
Yes, my thank yous are going to be very, very fast. Thank you to all of the speakers. Just a quick, I'll share with you. We planned this program to be in person in March of this year, and we had set up everything when COVID struck, and then we had to go into lockdown. The speakers rescheduled many times to accommodate us, and I'm very, very thankful because we asked them for their expertise and their experience, and they brought it full force today. I'm glad that most of you are here to have benefited. I'm also very thankful for the participants. All of you are still here, 20 minutes past the time of ending. It shows, it gives me hope for your interest and your commitment to take the ideas that you heard today forward. So I hope that this has been a good program. We thank the speakers and the participants. Thank you to the GCF committee that also worked hard to get this up and running. Thank you very much. There will be a feedback form that comes around. Do make sure you fill it out and send us your ideas. For those of you who are here for the AGM, the GCF AGM, which will start at 11:30, there is another link that should be sent to you. Please join through that link. Thank you very much for being with us today.